everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're sitting down with a brand new guest. Her name is Sara Mastros. She has written a fascinating book called The Sorcery of Solomon, a guide to the 44 planetary pentacles of the Magician King. And so, Sara, welcome to the show. We've been trying to make this happen for a long time, but we did it. Here we are.
It's true. I looked back at our email chain, and just to let the audience know, we've had to reschedule this podcast for a variety of very legitimate reasons on both of our ends for months.
So the last time I was like, I don't want you to think I'm dodging you. I swear to you, I want to have this conversation.
That's how I felt too. I was like, I want to do this, but no, which I find, so I'm going to throw this out there. I find as a magician, right, that whenever I'm approaching a big initiation, there is like a pushback to it. And I am not suggesting that this is going to be a big initiation for either of us, but I honestly do think it's like maybe a good sign that like something transformative is going to happen. Yep. Because to me, it's an indication that like what we are doing here is maybe like bucking the flow a little bit. You know what I mean? Like we're not going with the flow. We had to do some stuff to make this happen.
That's right. We had to pull some strings. I am in
favor of that.
Right.
Exactly.
Awesome. All right, so we'll get into the book in just a moment, but real quick, maybe just take a few minutes to talk to us about yourself for people who might be new to you and your work. I think a lot of my listeners will be. Who are you? What do you do? Tell us what we need to know.
So let me preface this by, I actually find this question very, in my line of work, I have to answer this question a lot, but I find it a very difficult question because I don't know what people want to know. Mm-hmm. So my name's Sara Mastros. I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I am currently 46 years old. I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I make my living as a professional sorceress and witchcraft educator. Mm-hmm. Before I did that, I taught high school math. I guess technically, immediately before that, I taught high school math and also did some high school administration. Before that, I taught university math. And before that, I was a graduate school student in math. But before that, I was a witch the whole time, right? So I sort of believe that all the natural state of children, right, is sort of an animist approach to the world where the world we live in is alive and full of consciousness and beings with whom you can interact, and that magic comes very naturally to children, and that our culture systemically beats that out of children, and that just didn't take on me, which is partly because I'm too weird, so a lot of cultural conditioning I was not conditionable in that way. But also I had really good parents, so religiously, because I understand this podcast to be mostly about religion, right? My mother grew up Reform Jewish. My family's been Reformed for a long time. In fact, my ancestors helped found the Reform movement in the United States. My father grew up Greek Orthodox, but neither of them grew up very religious, right? So for me, it's really important that I feel like a lot of white Americans or white passing Americans like me, right, come up with effectively no intact cultural transmission. And I came up with two different intact cultural traditions, but not really a lot of religiosity on other side. As a kid, if you had asked me what religion I was Jewish. But really, the fundamental features of being Jewish were all cultural and tribal, right? And religiously, the most important element of growing up Jewish where I grew up was not being Christian. I grew up in Bible country where not being Christian was unusual and also dangerous, just as in many, many parts of the United States today and in many parts of Christendom, being a not Jewish child is a dangerous thing to be. Right. And so my views on religion are deeply influenced by that. But I feel really lucky because I think when you grow up in a dominant religion, just like when you grow up white with white privilege, until something happens to woke you, right, to shake you out of your complacency, you don't really you have no reason to examine how things work, right? Because it doesn't really happen in your sight. Right. And similarly, I think when people grow up with Christian privilege, many of them get the whole way to adulthood without this question that you ask, what if? It is baffled to people who grew up in Christendom but not Christian. You ask that question before you learn to talk. That the overwhelming majority of people you interact with worship a creature that wants to send you to hell.
Yep.
And like, it's pretty easy to ask that what if question. So I'm really intrigued. Like, to me, it's very mind blowing to interact with people who never asked that question until they were adults.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which, like, I understand why, because you can't, you know, if you grow up in completely, like, fish don't know what water is, and Christians don't know what Christianity is.
That's true.
Until, like, for a long time, many of them never, like, many Christians never get woke to the systemic evil that is Christianity, right? Or at least is deeply interwoven in American Christianity, right? And so I'm always really interested to look at that. But like religiously, that's sort of where I come from. But I will say, like, you know, I understand this sounds weird. I don't really think of myself as like especially religious. Like, I'm a magician, right? And I'm religious in the sense that I have deep and important and transformative relationships in my life with gods, including but not exclusively the God of Israel, right? But yeah, I don't know that I would necessarily characterize myself as especially religious.
Yeah.
But I do sort of like religion. Here's what I will say, right? To wrap it up. I simultaneously am deeply, deeply suspicious and actively opposed to organized religion. And also,
why? I don't know what's in why.
I mean, I will come back and talk about why. And also, I have a genuine divine calling to organize religion. And that's, you know, complicated.
The irony. Right.
It's complicated. Right. It's complicated. And also, I see. Yeah. I'm gonna wait for more questions to say.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, yeah, but what you were just saying about, like, for instance, like Christianity, like a fish, you know, doesn't know the water that it's swimming in. Like, I feel like for me, like, I grew up in the Christian church, and we talked about this before we hit record through email exchange.
Right.
You know, in a evangelical world, and it was very narrow. It was believe this or go to hell, and try to get everybody in the world to believe this as well, so they don't go to hell when they die. And that was what I was raised with. And I went to Bible college. I went to 3 years of seminary for a master's degree, 3 more years for a doctoral degree, all in an evangelical world. And it wasn't until I got out of that place, like, started to realize, like, towards the end of my doctoral program, that, like, this doesn't really, I feel like something's wrong. Like, this isn't sitting right with me anymore. And so I started to explore some things. But once I started this podcast, I started to talk to other people. I began to realize, like, wait a minute, like, I've been sold a whole heap of lies, because there's so much more to not just Christianity, but religion as a whole, that I feel like I've been kept in the dark about. I mean, I was just told, I mean, for instance, like witchcraft, like I just came out of seminary with this idea that witches were, I mean, just short of flying on brooms. Like, that's what they did. They were just evil people. They were bad, you know, and that was it.
Flying on brooms an evil thing to do.
I mean, but you know, in my mind, I just had this idea. I just had this vision in my head of what these particular people look like. But it wasn't until I started to engage with people like yourself that I began to realize, like, well, I have a lot that I can learn from people who are very different from myself, and these people are not as bad or bad like I was taught that they are. And it just was mind blowing for me. So to your point,
thank you for noticing.
Yeah. So to your point, I mean, I think you're spot on with what you said.
I mean, I think that when you look at the historical origins of Christianity, it's easy to see why Christianity, which I think, here's the thing that I think is not always obvious to people who came up Christian. Christianity is not like most religions. Like, Christianity is actually the outlier among world religions in many, many ways.
Yeah.
Right? But especially like modern American evangelical Christianity is quite different. Like, just structurally, the emphasis on faith as to the almost complete exclusion of like praxis in any kind of meaningful way. Like, it's quite unusual, atypical compared to other religions. And I think, like, if you look at the history of how Christianity developed, it's easy to see like why that is. That like Christianity was designed from the beginning like as a political tool and narrative, and it like doesn't grow. I mean, there is basically no organic growth in early Christianity. Like it is almost entirely fueled by like political mechanisms. And that happens in many religions, but it is like particularly the case in Christianity, I think, relative to many other world religions that are less doctrinal and less hierarchical and less Christianity is like designed to function in a colonized society. Like it doesn't arise in any indigenous population. Like it arises almost exclusively among colonizers in Greece. Like what we talk about is Christianity. Like I know that like the evangelical narrative, right, is that what we call Christianity originates in the land of Israel. But like if you look at the history, nothing we would recognize as Christianity happened there. Like Christianity happened in the Rome, like in Rome and in Greece, right? Like outside of Israel. And there are like a lot of features of Christianity that like are about that. And that makes it in many ways difficult to disambiguate the history of Christianity and the history of European colonialism, because in fact, like they are nearly identical.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the mind-blowing things for me learning was just how, like you said, how married to politics early Christianity was, especially when it came to like Rome and things like that, and like Constantine, and just having all of a sudden this religion, this small sect, I guess you could say, of people who followed Jesus or whatever had no power, but all of a sudden got all the power, right? Because
well, there's actually, I will say, basically no historical evidence for the existence of a disempowered Christian church. Like actually like as soon as Christianity like exists in an extra, like except in the gospel,
sure,
right, like the actual existence of a Christian church, like is already among primarily, like I'm not saying the laity is primarily rich and powerful, but like the people inventing Christianity are like elite, powerful, and Roman.
And I guess that's the thing. Like, I think it's the people, maybe like the pre-Christians, I should say, like the people who they didn't have a label. They were following Jesus. They were, many were persecuted for their faith.
Yeah, well,
those people,
yeah,
what I'm saying is that when
I'm going to push back. Were they persecuted for their faith, or were they persecuted for their political activity?
And I don't know. Yeah.
I guess here's what I'm saying. The backdrop, the historical backdrop against which the Gospels are set is open, violent, armed revolution against a colonizing force. And Christianity is on the wrong side of that. Like Christianity is on the side of the colonizers. When they say render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, they mean Judea. When they say like you don't have no need of immediate real world political liberation because you will have liberation in the world to come. When they say make peace, beat your plowshares or beat your swords into plowshares, what they mean is stop killing Roman colonizers and just pay your fucking taxes. Like that's the political backdrop. Like that's what's happening. Like that's who the Gospels are being preached to. Are Jews living outside the land of Israel, right? Who are sending money and young men to fight Roman colonization in Israel. Like that's what's happening when the Gospels are being written. And the Gospels are actively preaching against that revolutionary liberation movement. So like, the fact that eventually they start to push back on Rome a little, like doesn't mean like, were they persecuted for their faith? That is a bold claim that no one except Christians in the ancient world would make. And that I think there is scant historic evidence to support. But I will also say, like, I appreciate that you went to Christian seminary and I didn't, and you maybe have a better background in that history than I do, though I will say I don't trust the people who taught it to you.
Yeah,
I don't think you should either.
Yeah, and that's
So,
what I'm realizing is that I was given such a narrow understanding of things because like the explanation that you just gave gives a whole different perspective on the background of the Christian
yeah.
faith that many of us were not given.
So I'm just gonna advise your
Yeah.
listeners, right,
Yeah.
to Google something called the Bar Kokhba Rebellion.
Hmm.
BAR space KOCHBAR Rebellion. That is what's going on.
Hmm.
Like the setting of the gospels, there's like a whole bunch of stuff going on in Israel at the time those stories are happening,
Hmm.
and that's what it is.
Hmm.
I mean, the Bar Kokhba Rebellion under that name is happening when the Gospels are being written, not when they're being set. But the Bar Kokhba Rebellion is really like the last of a series of, the land of Israel held out against Roman colonization
Hmm.
longer than almost anywhere.
Hmm.
Like hundreds and hundreds of years, Rome tried to subdue Judea, and Christianity is how they finally did it.
Hmm.
Like Christianity is what broke the Judean liberation movement.
Hmm.
And like by the time Christianity had taken root in Israel, like a third of all Jews had been massacred, right? Many villages had been razed to the ground, and Jews were no longer welcome in the land of Israel.
Hmm.
And I appreciate that almost all early Christians didn't understand that is what was going on, because I've been in a lot of revolutionary political meetings. Like, I don't know if your listeners go to those kinds of meetings, but I do. And there's always a Fed in the room.
Hmm.
And what if, because that's the question we ask here, what if Jesus were actually a plant of the Roman imperial government whose messaging was carefully designed as psyops to disturb, to stir up, right, and cause chaos within the Judean liberation movement. What
Hmm.
if that were true? And then I think if you look at history, you'll be like, oh, well, if that were true, history would have played out exactly the way history played out.
Yeah. Huh.
Instead, if you think, what if Jesus were the Jewish Messiah? How would history have played out? And you will find that is not what happened.
Hmm. So if I'm
So
hearing
that is
you,
my position.
yeah. So if I'm hearing you correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm trying to follow the line of thinking,
Yeah.
is the Roman Empire was trying to occupy the land of the Jews.
Yes, and they had been. I mean, they were successfully occupying it, but there was
they held it off
at high cost. Like there was a lot of like Roman imperial soldiers were getting murdered in the streets like every day by revolutionaries. And like they had not fully exerted control yet.
Right. And so Christianity became almost like the Trojan horse.
That Christianity was designed to be
by
the Roman. I don't know what the ancient Roman equivalent of the CIA is, but I'm sure they had one. Like every empire has secret police who engage in propaganda missions. And to me, like, if I read the Gospels and I read them in the context of a solid knowledge of like the historic and cultural context in which they were being written and promulgated, and then I look at political propaganda today, like the exact kind, like, again, if you are in revolutionary political meetings, and if you're not, you should be, like, if you're in those meetings, I'm not saying like terrorism, I'm saying like go to a socialist meeting sometime, right? And like you will, if you are paying attention, there's a federal agent in that room, and if you're not an idiot, you can tell who they are. And if you listen carefully to what they say, because they're really only talking to the dumb people, like if you are an idiot, you might not be able to tell which one they are, but if you are paying attention and you're woke to the fact that like there's a Fed in the room, and you listen to what they say, and then you read the Gospels, you'll notice they're like identical.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, and so I am not saying that I know for 100% certain that is a historical reality. Indeed, I actually don't believe Jesus existed as a historical figure. I think the Gospels are completely made up decades after the time period in which they are set.
Yeah.
But if he was a historical figure, I have to ask myself, I have to ask myself, why would somebody have written, like, who wrote those books and why did they write them? And we have actually like a pretty solid, like, we can say with some certainty, like, who wrote the Gospels. I don't mean like individual people,
Sure.
but we know
Groups,
where
right.
they were written and when they were written and the social class of the people involved, which you can tell from like the ways they use Greek and etc. Right. And if you know the historical context, I think you can make some educated guesses about what their motivations were. And to me, like, the most reasonable explanation for their motivations is that their goal was to further the Roman conquest of Judea. And I say that because I judge trees by their fruit. And that is the fruit of Christianity.
Yeah.
Is like colonization and genocide.
Yeah.
And slavery and conquest. Like those are the fruits of that tree.
Yeah.
By and large, historically.
Sure.
That's where I'm coming from. But I understand this is a very unpopular message, and I will try and be nice about it.
No.
And I really want to hit this point. I do not think that I think the overwhelming majority of Christians, both historically and today, are unwitting patsies in that. Just like I believe that the overwhelming majority of white Americans unwittingly perpetuate white supremacy.
Yeah.
I do not think that most Christians I do not want to believe that most Christians intend to be perpetuating a violent doctrine of Christian supremacy. But I do 100% think that the overwhelming majority of Christian leadership, political leadership, that money, the people who actually get shit done at the top of that church hierarchy, I think they know perfectly well what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I think even casual observation of their behavior makes it clear that they are, and I do not throw this word around, I want to remind you that I am a professional sorceress, they are fucking wicked. You know?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. How many kids do you got to rape? Like, how many kids do priests have to rape before maybe you start to suspect that there's something wrong in a church?
Yeah.
How many people does a church have to lynch before you start to think like, oh, maybe these people aren't on the right side of history? And I appreciate that that is harder to see from the inside, but I do think that it's really, really important that once you see it, it's important to like heal your own traumatized wounds, but it's important to stay woke to the fact that Christianity is structurally supremacist and structurally oppressive and structurally wicked.
Yeah.
And I know like in at least the kind of circles I move in, maybe less so in the ones you move in, like the concept of sin is like not a thing I'm supposed to talk about. I know sin when I'm fucking looking at it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Christian supremacy is a wicked, sinful, malicious activity that does harm to the world.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the world would look like if Christianity had never existed. But I can imagine a lot of better versions of the world.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question. This next question, we might never get to your book at this rate, but I'm just going to ask you this question. Well, I'm just going to ask you this question.
Sure.
Is there, like, given some of that perspective you just gave us on early Christianity, and I think it was before we hit record, we talked about how my awakening, that there were many different ways that people thought about Jesus, the cross, all these different doctrines, things like that in history, like the Gnostics, things like that.
Sure.
Is it possible, given all of those roots, all those different things, today, to be someone who is a Christian, who's trying to follow the quote ways of Christ, identify in that way, and make a positive difference in the world, apart from all of that crap and all of that baggage you just gave us?
Yes, absolutely. I have known a handful of people who do that. All of them have been censured by their own churches. Like they have been denied a pulpit in their own church, like whatever church tradition they came up in, they are, if they are still welcome in it. So for example, I have one friend, like, I don't want to name names, but I have one friend who, like, I would definitely categorize as that. and she was in seminary, and they refused to let her graduate because she talked about the fact that like maybe the Christian church had a lot of fucking blood on its hands.
Yeah.
So like, yes, I definitely think it is possible to be a good Christian. I am skeptical about what, just like it's probably possible to like be in the KKK and sympathize with some of the ideas of the KKK, but like not be one of those white supremacists. I mean, like Christianity is inherently doctrinally Christo supremacist. Like there's no formulation of Christianity that, at least I've never heard a formulation of Christianity that I would not characterize as Christo supremacist. So like I do think it's possible to do that, but I do say of the handful of Christians I personally know who I think are making a good impact in the world, I think all of them would be making more of powerful impact if they renounced Christ and all of his works. Like I do, and over the some of these people decades of knowing them, the further and further they got from Christianity, the better and better their works are. And I believe that they will eventually break away, if not in this lifetime, then in another one.
So
but
what
I
are
also
like
appreciate that that's so hard to do.
Yeah.
So hard. Like I do appreciate that like getting shunned by your entire family and like everyone you've ever known, and now you have to deal with all this bullshit that Christians do to the rest of us that like you don't know how to do because your parents did not teach you what to do when a Christian throws a rock at you. But like I understand that's a lot. Like I do, and I do not think that that is a reasonable expectation on most people. But I do think that the sort of person who has a calling to like genuinely do good works in the world, right? To give to, I don't want to be like melodramatic about this, but to like pledge their life in service of making things better. It's hard for me to understand why they would keep returning to a well that is so polluted when there are so many other options available.
So my question then would be like,
but I am interested to hear why, because I have had this conversation with many of those people and I've never heard an answer I found satisfying.
So my question would be like, when you talk about the like renouncing the works of Christ, for instance, I think that's what you said a couple minutes ago. Like what?
I mean, in a historic way, but also as a sorceress, I mean, in a spiritual way.
So what are the works of Christ? Because I'm genuinely curious about this.
In my experience,
that
they're
ought to
mostly
be
like colonization, slavery, Holocaust, the entire notion of hell, the entire notion of a retributive afterlife at all, the whole notion of salvation through faith, which I find like deeply fucking suspect. Right? Like all of those things. Everything that distinguishes Christianity from other religions. Like the parts that are just like, you know, everything's connected and try and be a good person, those are not unique to Christianity, and you can keep those while jettisoning Christianity. Like I'm not saying to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I am saying, however, to like empty the tub and rescue that baby before it drowns.
No, like I think of myself, because like where I'm at in my journey, and I'll be honest with you, like and I don't know if I've even talked about this on the podcast before, but I'll share it with you anyway. My wife and I, we both grew up in the same kind of a setting, and we're both in this place where we've really done a lot of rethinking of our faith. And for me, one of the places where it began, one of the biggest threads, I should say, is when my daughter was born. I was just at the end of my seminary degree, and she was born. They rushed her to the NICU, and I'm running down the hallway with these doctors, no idea what's going on, panicking. They put her in the tank, put all the stuff on her, all these wires. They say, "You stick your hand in the tank." I'm like, "All right, I stick my hand in the tank." And she reaches out and she grabbed my finger. And I had this theological crisis in the NICU where I was like, this idea of original sin, people going to hell, this is all ridiculous. This is ridiculous. Because I thought to myself, how in the world could this God, who we sing about in church on Sunday as a good, good father, how could he be such a monster when I feel nothing but love in my heart for this child, who I don't care what this child grows up to do. I could never think of a situation where I would ever throw this child into a fire or whatever it might be. Like this, that's ridiculous to me. So I said to my wife, I'm like, we got to rethink whatever it is that we're doing here. So that was
Right.
like the one of the first threads of the journey. And fast forward, all these different years, we've had like I started to ask like a lot of different questions, push back on a lot of different things. I can't tell you how many professors from my seminary have reached out to me to scold me in my direct messages. Before I got my doctoral degree, I before they handed me the piece of paper, they sat me down and gave me a long lecture, so to
Yeah.
speak, about this podcast, about
Right.
what I was doing, a lot of warnings, things like that.
Yeah.
We
Of
have
course they did.
family members who we haven't talked to in 3 or 4 years. They refuse to have anything to do with us because of the
Right.
questions that we're asking. So for me, like I still consider myself a Christian,
Right.
but I look at myself as more of maybe like a mystical Christian, if
Sure.
that would make sense. Like someone
I
who
mean,
embraces the mystery of the whole of the divine, of the universe, all these different things. And
let me ask this question. What
yeah,
about that is Christian?
well, because my next thing is when I
Mhm.
when I look at like the Bible, for instance,
Mhm.
I have a love-hate relationship with the Bible because
Sure.
like I grew up reading it devotionally, every single
Sure.
day, memorizing all different pieces of it. It was the inerrant, perfect word of God, blah 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 blah. But now I'm in this place where I put the Bible away for like 6 months because
Mhm.
I'm like, I can't read this thing anymore
Right.
through the lens, other than through the lens I was given. But now I've picked
Right.
it back up over the last couple of years, and I see it more as like this collection of writings
Sure.
where people were walking through their own life, their own circumstances, their own cultures, which are vastly removed from ours,
Sure.
languages removed, cultures removed, everything else, trying to figure out like what does it look like to navigate through this life, this very visible life with a very invisible God. Like what did that look like? And I read some of the letters, some of the poems. I feel like some people got it right and
Sure.
some people definitely got it wrong. So when I come across like the stuff about
Sure.
hell, I come across the stuff about, the things, you need salvation from
I'm
sin, all
gonna
these different things.
let me pause you a
I
second.
look at that and I'm like, I don't know, like that doesn't sit right with me anymore. Yeah.
What if they didn't get it wrong? What if they were intentionally and maliciously lying to
And
you?
that's the thing. That's the perspective I never thought of before. That never crossed my mind. And so that's what I think brings a
That
whole
seems
nother
weird.
that's what I think brings a whole nother perspective too, because again, being raised in that world,
Yeah.
that would have been a completely foreign idea. But
Did
now, in this place
did
I'm
you,
at now,
uh,
that seems like that could be a possibility in at least some circumstances.
so I guess here's what I'm gonna recommend. As
Yeah.
a like again, I sometimes have some qualms about the word religious when applied to me. So let's
Yeah.
say spiritually.
Right.
But I don't really like that word either. Because what I mean is I believe in the reality of spirits. And I
Yeah.
believe that the specific spirits you invite into your life, inviting different ones in changes the tenor of your life. So
Yeah.
I guess what
Huh.
if you actually put down Jesus? Like you
Mhm.
put down the Bible for 6 months and like sort of felt around what things were like without that. What
Yeah.
if you disinvited him from your heart?
Hmm.
Kicked him out for a little while. And I'm told he'll take you back if you do that. So there's really no danger, right? That's like his whole shtick, actually, right? Like renounce him,
Yeah.
remove his influence, take those blinders off,
Hmm.
and see what the world looks like when you can see it without him whispering nonsense into your head.
Yeah.
And what if you did that? What would you find out? To my way of thinking, there's a very easy experiment you could perform to find out what would happen if you did that. You could just do it.
Hmm.
And if afterwards you found out that your life was better with that spirit in it, you can invite him back. I'm told he's into that.
Right. Yeah. And I think too, like,
So
and
that's
from
what I mean by renounce Christ.
yeah.
I mean, at some point, I am told that, like, as a Christian, you make like a conscious decision, especially as an evangelical Christian, you make some
Yeah.
kind of conscious decision to invite Jesus into your heart
Yeah.
and let him, you hand over the wheel, let him be your co pilot or whatever, however
Yeah.
y'all say it. What if you stopped doing that for a while and you saw what impact that had on your life?
Hmm.
And I think you would find, and I say this based on the observation of many, many, many people who have done it,
Hmm.
not all, occasionally people go back, like that does happen,
Hmm.
right? But overwhelmingly, once people leave Christianity, they don't choose to go back.
Hmm.
And so I guess, what if you looked like Like, what if Christ is actually not the ineffable one who moment by moment creates the universe? What if actually those are completely distinct spirits that are not the same, right? And like having Christ in between you and that ineffable one is making it hard for you to see that ineffable one. And what if actually that spirit was specifically grown and engineered over millennia by wicked men for the specific purpose of occluding you to the true nature of reality? What if that were true?
Yeah. Huh.
So that's what I mean when I say that.
Blew my mind.
Thank
Wow.
you.
Yeah. No, that's good.
Welcome.
And I never thought of that before. And I think that's because like the even the
Well, a
thing with the
lot of people are very invested in keeping you from thinking that. Like, it's not your fault that you didn't think of that. A lot of people spent a lot of money. Like, a lot of people engaged in millennia of warfare and murdered millions of people to prevent you from thinking that.
Yeah. Huh. Well, it was so freeing for me when I put the Bible down.
Yeah.
Because
imagine how freeing it will be when you actually put it down.
Yeah, because like I remember, I put it away, and it was like 2 weeks. I was like, the inner Christian soldier was like, you better pick up that Bible.
Yeah.
You better read that Bible because things are gonna go bad in your life.
What if you got rid of that guy?
Yeah, I'm like, yeah, that Christian soldier's in there. I mean, and I talk about that on the show a lot.
Exorcise him. That is what I am recommending.
How do you do that? Like, how do you
I mean, do you want specific advice? Like, okay, there are like I can give specific advice. Now, like, I am happy if individual people want to email me, I will take these emails and I will answer that question, because it depends on how he got in there in the first place. Right? So, like, and I don't know all the ins and outs of Christianity.
Sure.
I know that from the inside, different kinds of Christianity seem really different, but from the outside, they don't seem that different to me. So, like, right? But you need to figure out when and how he got in there. And my impression is that it is a combination of rituals. The first of which is baptism, which for most people, I think most Christians are infant baptized. True.
Yeah, I was. Yeah.
I think generally, like, I grew up in Anabaptist country, but my impression is most American Christians were baptized as children.
Yeah.
Right. And then there's additionally in evangelicalism some kind of like born again moment thing. Right. So I think the first thing to do is write a timeline of how that happened. And those happen in highly ritualized ways.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there was a lot of ritual around them, and you simply have to undo those rituals. So the easiest way, right, is to let somebody else baptize you into something else, to wash it away, to get a professional ritualist, just like the priest who baptized you in the first place, or preacher. Again, I do understand that there is like some distinction in Christianity between words like priest and preacher, and that like and pastor, but like whatever. I don't it doesn't seem like even Christians agree on what those things are. So I'm gonna call the entire category of professional ritualist, even the non-Christian ones, like, I am indeed a professional ritualist, like I am a priest, right? So you can let a priest baptize, like, wash it away for you, but that's kind of like, as a Christian might say, robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? So I would encourage people, especially people with you who have a lot of training in that kind of thing. Like, whether you've done it or not, you were taught how to do that kind of priesting.
Many times. Yeah.
Right. So you think about the rituals that let him in, and you construct a ritual to get him out.
Yeah.
Right. There are traditional ways to do that. Right. So, like, almost any beginner Satanist text will include some kind of like baptism renunciation. But again, I generally encourage people not to trade one priest for another priest, but to forswear priests generally, like living priests and also spirit priests, right? And I will also say that I would argue that that's what Torah says as well, right? So I don't know, did you learn Hebrew in seminary?
I took very little Hebrew. I did a little bit,
So I think one thing that I really encourage Christians to do is read non-Christian translations of the Bible. Because I think you will find that that what you were told that book says is not maybe
there's a little bit of an agenda in a lot of the translations.
Yeah, but like, look, I can't quote chapter and verse. Near the end of Devarim, which Christians call Deuteronomy,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's a passage that says something like, because it doesn't say anything in English. So when people are like, oh, the exact chapter and verse, I'm like, oh, I don't know, you know this, but if you say it in English, it's definitely not. It says
Right.
something like, do not think that the teaching, I've noticed that Christians tend to translate that word as law or
Mm-hmm.
commandment, but it actually means instruction.
Mm.
Do not think that the teaching I have set before you this day is too hard for you. Do not think that you have to send somebody up to heaven to fetch it down for you. It is close to you, in your mouth and in your heart, or something. Like, again, that's maybe not exactly word for word, but again, it's near the end of Deuteronomy. I think it's immediately after I don't know. When you went to seminary, do you know where that is? Maybe
I don't remember
40-ish?
exactly where it is, but I
It's
know what you're
toward
talking
the
about
end of
now.
Deuteronomy, after the
Yeah.
Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments come up a couple of times.
Sure.
Right. And after the time they come up toward the end of Deuteronomy,
Yeah.
it's in there.
Yeah.
Right. And like, to me, like, that's kind of what I'm saying. Like, don't think that you need a priest to do it for you. Don't even think that you need a spirit intermediary between you and it. Like, what if you just try doing it yourself?
Yeah.
Right. And see
Yeah.
how it works. And I find, horror movies teach that, like, exorcism is really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And there are exorcisms that are quite hard. Like, possession is real. Like, a human being can be possessed by a thing that's not them. But not most people. Like, you need to be, let me think metaphorically. Just like we are swimming in germs all the time, but most of us are fine because we have like a robust immune system that protects us from that. Like, we are swimming in spiritual miasma all the time, especially in our culture, which is like a miasmically dense culture, right? Because we don't exactly believe in those things. And also we let the demons do most of the preaching.
Right.
So like, it's not a great place to be, but like, still, most people still have a robust natural sort of spiritual immunity to that kind of thing. But so, like, it's actually, even if you're trying to get possessed, actually, it's quite hard for most humans to hold a possession for more than like 5 or 10 minutes. So the kind of like possession you see in like an Exorcist movie, I'm not saying it's not real, but like, there was definitely something, that person had been deeply, deeply, deeply traumatized before that happened.
Yeah.
FYI, the most common biographical detail shared by people who require exorcisms is rape by Christian priests, which kind of messes you up inside and is quite common, right? So, but like it's actually pretty easy to get a spirit, including a Jesus. Like, a baptism is like that's what it is. When you let Jesus into your heart, that's a voluntary possession.
Yeah.
You should perhaps disinvite him for a while. And he's like not a demon. Like, he's not my favorite god or anything, but he's not a demon. He will leave if you tell him he's not welcome. For almost everybody. Like, if you simply assert like, you are not welcome here and I don't want to hear from you, go away. Like, he will generally listen, is my experience. Right. And so like, I really encourage people to do that. And then if you decide you want him back, you could ask him back.
Yeah.
Doesn't Paul actually have like a whole thing about how like that's the best kind of Christian?
Right. Yeah.
Like, the one who,
yeah. And I think
maybe not. Maybe there's a doubting time. I don't know. I feel like the Gospels say a lot of contradictory stuff.
Yeah, but I think what you're
but
saying,
I can cherry pick too.
Right? Yeah, but I think like
the devil's also good at quoting scripture.
Yeah, right. Thinking back, like, on just again, like, leaving the Bible behind, like picking it back up again, I was able to pick it up with a much different perspective.
Right.
I was able to reject a lot of the things that I used to take as gospel, so to speak. And I think that time away did me a lot of good to get in touch with my own self. And to realize that my own self is not a horrible, despicable, rotten human being, but that I actually have a lot of good inside of me and a lot of sense that I can make of different things. So I'm thinking, if someone were to take this route to exorcise Christ from their life and then come to this place where they want to invite him back, they can invite him back more on the terms of having come to a fuller understanding of who they are apart from him, and perhaps become to realize, like, oh, some of these things that I took for granted were Christ or were representative of Jesus are really more representative of the people who created this image that we have in our mind. And so I'm going to bring him back on.
So the other way, the other way, that some of the good things that I was attributing to Christ actually had nothing to do with Christ. They were me all along. I was the good one in that equation. Actually, he was making it worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
both directions. But I think, there's no way to know until you try. So I
Yeah.
encourage people to experiment with that.
Yeah. Huh.
And again, it's really about thinking about how we got there and just doing that backwards, basically.
Right.
But
Right.
he's like, you know what I mean? Like you invited him in, hustle him back out, sort of
Yeah.
along the same route.
Yeah.
Which is like a substantive spiritual undertaking. Like it's not a thing you whip out in an afternoon.
Yeah. 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 It's funny, and one of the other things too, I was thinking of, and I made a note of this before because I wanted to bring it up. You had talked about, I said about the Bible and how,
Mm-hmm.
you had said that, well, what if the people who are writing the Bible, what if it was more, some of these things were more deceptive in
Yeah.
terms of they were writing, certain things that weren't true or whatever. One of the things that was eye-opening for me was when I came out of seminary, I started to do a lot of studying on my own. I came across a guy named Bart Ehrman. I don't know if you've heard of him before.
I have. I'm not like I'm not extremely familiar with his work, but
Yeah,
like
so Bart
I've
Bart
read
used
a book.
yeah, so Bart used to be a fundamentalist Christian
Right.
preacher, and
Mm-hmm.
he now is an atheist, but
Right.
he's still a historian.
Right.
And I came across some of his work, and he talks a lot about in the New Testament, a lot of the writings of Paul that were attributed to Paul. And I was always told growing up, yes, Paul wrote these different letters. The fact
Mm-hmm.
is that Paul didn't write these letters. They were written
Yeah.
in Paul's name, and they
Sure.
were they were forged. And a
Yeah.
lot of the things, if you read them, are very contradictory to
Yeah.
some of the things that are attributed to Paul. And
Right.
so for me, that was very eye-opening. So I think that going on that line of thinking that you said, I think I just had a light bulb moment that perhaps that's the case, not just in those few letters, but perhaps that's the case in a lot of different instances in and throughout the Bible.
I think that is the case in all texts.
Mm.
Like I think, the New Testament, a name I am not fond of. Like that's a deeply supersessionalist name for the Christian Bible. But like, um, it it happens a lot faster than many other religious texts.
Mm-hmm.
Like the oldest piece of the Christian Bible, like the New Testament, the Christian
Yeah.
Bible, to the newest piece is like not that long of a span of time
Yeah.
relative to, say, like Torah or the Rig Veda or like the Buddhist sutras. Like they evolve over a much longer span of time. So it's a little harder to disambiguate. But like the Christian Bible, I actually think we as I said before, like you can pretty clearly see historically like who wrote it
Yeah.
and when and where.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that actually makes it pretty easy to think about why.
Yeah.
And I think every single text you read, but particularly a text that somebody tells you is like inerrant, which is like, and I may be super clear about this. As a person with a graduate degree in theoretical mathematics, I do like, so I'm not coming from nowhere when I say this. I do not believe in the existence of inerrant truth,
Yeah.
including mathematical truth.
Mm.
Right?
Yeah.
Um, like if somebody tells you something is inerrant truth, especially if they tell you it's inerrant truth and it's translated, like what does that even mean?
Right.
Like, I think it's always profitable to ask who wrote that and who did they write it for and
Yeah.
why.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think in particular, like, it's important to understand that like Torah, people who aren't Jewish are not the intended audience of that text. Like it is not intended as a universalist text
Mm-hmm.
or like inerrant text in the way that Christians would understand inerrant.
Yeah.
Right? Like the people who wrote it did not intend it that way. Like they're pretty clear about it in the text itself.
Yeah.
And like and it's written by a lot of different people, which is like quite like in Hebrew, it's you can tell like it's in different voices. They're not all this, right? When it's all translated by one person, it's easy to get in your head that like, oh, this is like one sort of coherent voice speaking this.
Yeah.
But when you read it even the Gospels, when you read them in Greek, it's very clear that like the person who wrote one of these did not write the other one. They have a very different diction in their Greek. Like they put words together in different ways. Like the way they construct poetry is very different. And like the poetry of Bereshit, of Genesis, is wildly different structurally and like formatively. Like, it's clear that even different pieces of Bereshit are noticeably different. Like, that in the way that, like, I don't know if anybody doing this has ever like read student essays, but once you've been teaching students for a while, you can kind of tell whose essay is whose just based on like the way they put words in order, right?
Sure, yeah.
And similarly, like, once you get the hang of it, when you read these texts in their original languages, like, you can tell that it's not the same person who wrote this as that, because this person really loves adjectives and this person is very into stacking prepositional phrases in their poetry, and like, and I think that that translation really does a great disservice to sacred text in particular. But like, you'll notice that to me it is hard to even disambiguate between the terms like sacred text and mythology and poetry. Like, to me it is hard to disambiguate. Like, I mean very close to the same thing when I use those words. And I think that is, and I say this as a person who, like, most of the books I write are indeed translations into English of those kinds of texts, right? So my first popular book was a translation of the Orphic hymns, which are a collection of sacred poetry, Greek pagan sacred poetry from late antiquity. This book is a translation of these pentacles, which are a kind of Hebrew amulet, right? So they're not text. They're much harder because there's no context. They're just like you can see they look like that is a pretty typical one. Right. It's like some Hebrew words, and they're hard to translate because there's not a lot of context, right? But like that's my specialty, right? And I do think that like there is no such thing as a translation without bias. And so like minimally, I think it's really important to understand that the nature of translation puts a coherent voice on what is actually a collection of quite different texts. And I think it's really important to like triangulate between a variety of translations. And most translations of the Bible actually have like an introduction or a foreword written by the translators, where they will like talk about, I mean, I know in seminary, you know this, but I assume most people listening to this have never actually read the introduction in their Bible. But like those translators' notes, they will talk about like what their goals were when they translated.
I didn't read those in seminary, Sarah. So yeah, I didn't learn that until after seminary.
I mean, of course not, because I imagine that your seminary stripped that. Like, I imagine your seminary would not permit you to read that, because if you had read them, you would have noticed that, like, this, what I'm saying is, if you read those, it will become, what I'm telling you will become very and immediately clear. So of course they didn't let you read them, because if they had let you read them, you wouldn't have fallen for their nonsense.
And that's what Bart says, is that every translation team has an agenda.
And I mean, like most honestly, if you pick up a Bible and it doesn't have an introduction that explains that agenda, I would stop reading. Like, I wouldn't, I mean, certainly not unless you've read many, many other translations. And in historic translations like the King James, it's not necessarily going to be in there, right? But if you go looking for it, you can find it.
It's just in the title, King James.
I'm gonna throw this out there. I don't trust sacred books written by kings.
Right.
Oh, except King Solomon.
Dead giveaway.
I do like the ones King Solomon. Like, I know I don't seem like a person who has a favorite book of the Bible, but I do, and it's called Ecclesiastes. Every time I read Ecclesiastes, like right in the heart. Like, that's the one that was written for me. Right. And like legendarily attributed to King Solomon, although I do not think any rational person actually believes an actual historic King Solomon wrote that text in the 9th century BC. Like, I mean, at your seminary, maybe they taught you that, but I don't think any, like, no rational person.
I no longer think that, but that's what I used to think. That's what I was
taught. I mean, that's what that's what like, and that's what kids get taught in, like, you know, Hebrew school for children too. But I mean, if you keep learning after you're a child, they teach you more. Like, right. And again, I am in no way suggesting that fundamentalism is a problem unique to Christianity, right? Like, Judaism,
it's everywhere.
We certainly have our own fundamentalists, and they're like maybe like low-key murdering a lot of people right now, right? In a way that is grotesque, right? And fully out of accord with Jewish values, and also wildly unpopular amongst the overwhelming majority of world Jews. Like, I know this doesn't get a lot of play in American media, so people might know this, but there are loud protests in the streets of Jerusalem every day about what's going on right now. And there were actually, before this even started, like Netanyahu was about to get deposed when all this happened because he is wildly unpopular. So like, I am in no way suggesting that these problems are unique to Christianity, but I do think that like the nature of Christianity, particularly American Christianity, which is partly about the nature of it being a dominant religion, but it's also about like the nature of it being an imperialized monotheism and the nature of it being like anti-scholarly. Like for a long time, Christians weren't even allowed to read that. Like it was illegal to translate the Bible for most of Christian history, right? Like, and I mean, my experience is that in many Christian communities, it is still like kind of frowned on to read the Bible by yourself and not just listen to what people tell you it says. So like, I do think that like, it's like harder to keep people like, fundamentalist Judaism has a very, very, very high attrition rate. Like most people who grow up in fundamentalist Judaism do not stay there. And it's because they do actually teach you to read those texts and commentaries on those texts. And if you're not, and a lot of people leave, but they strongly encourage you to have kids very, very young. And then you're kind of locked in that community. Like in a lot of, I mean, I imagine that happens in evangelicalism too, right? Like where they encourage you to have kids really early, and it's much harder to leave your community.
Once you get the kids in, like, then you're in.
I mean, especially in like really fundamentalist communities, right? So like deeply fundamentalist Jewish communities, like that religious community own, and I mean, I know people who grew up in deeply fundamentalist like Christian cults too, and like they own the judge, they own the cops, so like they're gonna take your kids away if you try and leave. Like right, like I don't know how many people grew like you grew up really evangelical, but you didn't grow up in like a cult, right?
Not like that. No, I mean I know people who have, but that wasn't me.
And that's what I'm saying. Like I guess what I'm saying is in Judaism, only cultists are fundamentalists. Right. And it's weird to me that like I find fundamentalism baffling. Like it's hard for me to like, I understand if you're fed it as a child. I guess. I don't know. I really I'm not trying to be dismissive. It is very clear that like Christianity, that it is years and years and years of traumatization, which makes people able to believe that. But it's so far from my own experience. It's like hard to understand how that worked.
I mean, it's you're fed it as a kid. I mean, I was in a private Christian school from the 4th through 12th grades. We went to church on Sundays, Sunday school, and I went to Bible college, seminary. So it was like all I ever knew. But it wasn't until I was kind of out in the world on my own. I had a child, and that was in that moment that I was like, all of a sudden this doesn't make a lot of sense. Like I don't really think that
I hear that a lot.
I don't feel like this is right, and then there were other experiences that surrounded that. It wasn't the only experience. There were some other things too, but I was like, all these things are coming together. I'm like, this isn't sitting right. I don't, in my mind and my heart's telling me this isn't right. I don't know what's right, but this isn't working. And once you see that, you can't unsee it.
So here's a tool to help people see that. So Aristotle teaches that there are 3 roads to knowledge, right? So in Greek, he calls them pistis, gnosis, and diagnosis, right? Pistis is usually translated as faith, but I think that word has a lot of baggage. So I prefer to translate it as trust. Like somebody I trust told me something, and that's how I know it's true. Right? So like, what's the capital of France?
Paris.
How do you know that? Like, have you ever been there? Have you
never been there?
Like, have you like voted in French? Right.
Never.
Like, people you trust told you that. That's how you know, right? Okay. Gnosis. What color is the sky?
Sky's blue.
How do you know?
Because I look up and I see blue.
Right. You have like direct personal experience of its blueness. That's the gnos. That's what gnosis means. Right. Diagnosis, which is the root of our English word diagnosis, means like knowledge that you come to through reasoning. Right. And Aristotle says that like all learning, all coming to knowledge is by one of these 3 paths or a combination of those 3 paths. And my experience is when those 3 paths appear to be in conflict with each other, I'm probably wrong about all of them.
Mm.
Like when my direct experience of the world is at odds with what I've been taught and is at odds with what like just reasoning tells me, probably all three of those cases I have come to a wrong conclusion.
Yeah.
And the truth is some complicated other thing.
Mm.
So like when you find that those three roads are in conflict, I think it's a signal to you to like investigate what is going on.
Yeah.
Because they should. They should be in accord with each other. Like if things are true, they should be true all three of those ways, argues Aristotle. And like, you know, I'm oversimplifying Aristotle here.
Sure.
But like that's generally
trying to jam it into a 3-minute explanation.
I mean, Aristotle only talks about it for like 10 minutes. and this is a fun, just historical fact. When we read Aristotle, we're almost certainly not reading Aristotle's words. We're reading his like lecture notes. We know because ancient commentators will sometimes talk about like the golden prose of Aristotle. And if you've ever read Aristotle in Greek, you will agree with me that it is not golden prose. Like it's perfectly fine, but he routinely says stuff like, in book 6 we will discuss, and like he definitely does not discuss that in book 6, like all the time the time. And so like most historians agree that when we read Aristotle, we're not actually reading what the ancients were reading, we're reading someone else's like lecture notes on Aristotle.
Now we know.
Just like the Gospels, you're not reading what Jesus said.
Right. So I was just
reading
thinking
what somebody said. Jesus
exactly.
said.
I was just thinking the same thing. You were taught maybe that that's what you're reading, but you're not reading that.
But and here's an interesting distinction: we do have contemporaries of Aristotle talking about Aristotle, and there is no contemporary mention, as far as I know, no one who was in Jerusalem when Jesus was speaking bothered to write it down, which is a little weird because we Jews love to fucking write shit down.
Right.
So like it's a little suspicious. Like it's a little suspicious that Jesus didn't write a book.
Right.
As Jews are prone to book writing.
Yeah.
Like we have thousands and thousands of pages of like Jewish commentary from that period, and none of them like know who this Jesus is. Like there's no mention of him.
Yeah.
Which is like a little sus.
Yeah, it is. It is.
But what if he were real and the Christian church has burned all those materials?
That's what I was just thinking, is what if he did something? What if he wrote something, but they just got rid of it? Right. They tried to get rid of a lot of the Gnostic texts. Yeah,
you know, they actually tried to get rid of Torah many times too, and they utterly failed, almost as if God actually wrote that one. You'd think if Jesus were God, he could probably have prevented that from happening.
Right.
But he didn't.
Right.
Like that's how I feel about Christianity. Like you can't have it both ways.
Right.
You can't have it like, oh, Jesus is God, but also all this stuff happened in Jesus' name that he wasn't there for. Like, I don't know, wasn't he there for? Like, that happened.
Right. Sarah, we're just about out of time. I'm sorry we didn't get to the book. I apologize.
No, that's fine. You know, the truth is, like, I'm happy for people to read this book.
Yeah.
If you have a US, Canadian, Australian, or New Zealand library card, you can probably read the ebook online for free. But I will say I actually would not expect this book to be of particular interest to your audience.
Yeah. Well, your publisher pitched it to me because of the concept of Solomon. And just everything that we've discussed in the email. And
publishers just want to sell books. Publishers are of the opinion that all publicity.
Have Sarah on your podcast.
Which I agree. Which I agree. But I'm just saying. I mean, really, what I'm saying is like the truth is, this book. If this is the first book on magic you ever read, this is a difficult. Like this is not actually a beginner.
It was very difficult reading.
It's a difficult, and it's difficult reading for you, and you have like years of seminary training, which is not like exactly what this is, but I mean, I'm just saying it's maybe not a beginner book.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think if I have any books. I mean, Orphic Hymns Grimoire, if you are just interested in like the nature of sacred poetry, I will say that the Orphic hymns are written very close to the same time as the Gospels and in the same places, right? And many people would say that Orphism, like I know the traditional narrative is that Christianity grows out of Judaism, but historically Christianity actually grows out of Orphism. And so like people might be interested in that text.
Okay. Well, if you're open to it, I'd love to have you back on again. We could talk about that or some other different things.
I'll come on as often as you want.
Some other rabbit holes we could go explore together.
Look, I sell books for a living, but I preach the good word for life.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to keep doing it. Like, I am happy to teach as long as people will listen.
Well, thank you.
Honestly, sometimes even if they won't.
Well, thank you. And thank you for taking time
You're
for us.
very
I
welcome.
appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.